an original.
From Story Studio Network.
Once around the park, James, and don't spare the horses.
There she blows. Here we go. November the 18th. It's a Friday. It's time for On the Ledge, your Ontario Politics podcast. And, well, if you're anywhere along, upstate New York or the Niagara Peninsula, just, hunker down. You got time to spend this weekend. You're going to be snowed in anyway. And we're happy to keep you company. And actually, there's a sort of a weird swath here coming off of Lake Huron and Lake Erie. And there's two of these snow squall storms that are roaring across the province. Looks like it's all going to really happen east of Toronto, and north and south. It's just one of these weird things. So in the meantime, all sunny and, roses here in the center of the universe. Welcome in. Dave Trafford here with you. John Wright from Maru Public Opinion. Keith Leslie from CH Television. And let's start, let's start with housing, just because there's so much on that file right now. Narwhal and Toronto Star doing a report, an investigative piece talking about the number of properties that were basically untouchable, no chance of ever developing them because they were in the Greenbelt, being sold or purchased, I should say, by developers in the last 4 years. Most recently, John, one of them was purchased. The sale went through in September, mere weeks before the housing minister announced plans to lift restrictions around parts of the Greenbelt. And gee, it just so happens that this one falls in there. And there's all kinds of, I think, worthy speculation, certainly flag raising around some of this in terms of who knew what when. We're never really going to know. Let's face that. But the stink around this, I don't know. It concerns me a little bit that a lot of this was going on, particularly when we do have video of the premier in the back rooms telling developers prior to the 2018 election, we'll take care of you in the Greenbelt. He comes out after that election saying, we heard you, we'll never touch the Greenbelt. And now here we are, months after being reelected, and the Greenbelt is back in play.
Yeah, and, I'm going to be careful what I say because you never know what can happen if you accuse somebody of doing something anyways. But the reality is, this is the sort of stink that does hang around because we have a long-term development plan. So even though it's reported today, it'll be harped on in the House, tomorrow, the next day after that, and going forward. Secondly, it's not the end of the reporting. So somebody will go in and find more things. Somebody will go and find who's donated to what, where, and how, and then they'll get to the people who are actually implicated in all of this. So it's something that strikes a chord with not just opposition members, but also just with the public who are cynical about inside jobs anyways.
Well, and Keith, I don't think, the argument, but we need housing. That's being used as a convenient excuse here. I mean, if in fact somebody knew something before they should have known something, that's the issue. It's not whether or not we need more housing.
There's no debate about whether we need more housing. There is debate whether 50,000 new homes on the Greenbelt will actually make a big dent into the 1.5 million they need each year for the next 10 years. Dave, in your first question to John, you used the word speculation because we don't really know what's going on here. Well, was there land speculation here, or was it a sure thing for some people? Mm-hmm. That's what seems to be the real question, doesn't it? People buying up land that is supposedly verboten, not going to be developed, just months before, all of a sudden it's developed. And as you say, we had, the video that was leaked just before the 2018 election of Doug Ford telling developers, we're going to, we'll get you some of that Greenbelt land. Then after there was a big public backlash against that, he'd come out and, as you say, very clearly stated, repeatedly, we will not touch the Greenbelt. Well, here we are. And of course, the housing crisis that existed now existed then. Are we really going to say that these 50,000 houses built in the Greenbelt are going to lower housing prices for people or become more affordable for people? I don't think so. The developers here are being rewarded. And at the same time, the municipalities under the same legislation are being punished because they're taking away the development fees. So these developers who would have paid these development fees, the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, that they estimate it's like $570 million a year, each year for the next 10 years, that they're not going to have that they're going to have to get, if they need new infrastructure for all these new homes, they're not going to have the money to build that infrastructure. They're going to have to go and put that money on residential taxpayers, maybe a little commercial base if they have one. Most municipalities, it's going to be on residential taxpayers. So why are the developers being rewarded? And again, is there any chance that those development fees that are coming out of the supposed cost for the developers, there's no way we can know they're passing that along in the form of savings? Market forces are what drive the prices of houses, not just availability, but all kinds of market forces. So this is seemingly, very clearly, developers are being rewarded, municipalities are being punished. A massive promise on the Greenbelt is just being tossed out the window, rolled right over. And the government, they literally precluded the municipalities from testifying at their hearing into this at the committee. The opposition parties had to hold their own committee on Thursday, or set up their own little hearing to let the municipalities vent on this and say how much it was going to cost them. I know we need houses. There's no doubt about that. But there was a pledge not to touch this. We saw the former mayor of Toronto, John Sewell, hauled out of committee hearings this week by security because he was railing against this. Former mayors of Toronto, Crombie and Barbara Hall, they were denied the right to testify. The government doesn't want to hear. They know what they're doing is wrong. There's just no defense for it, really, other than these developers and that Star and Narwhal investigation and the CBC one before it. Name names. They pointed out who these speculators were, who these land purchasers were, who these developers are, and they're clearly being rewarded here. Why? I mean, is this, let's say, 50,000 homes are going to be into the Greenbelt? There's 1.5 million homes needed. Do we need to go into the Greenbelt for that's 50,000 is a small number against what's actually needed here to go into the shatter the Greenbelt. It seemingly is a political risk this government is willing to take. Well, at the same time, they're fighting the education workers, looking at another school strike. They're just willing to plow ahead on, the hospitals are in crisis state. They don't even want to admit that. And yet here we are taking on this developer free ride, and I don't understand why.
Okay, so I want to get to some of those other issues first in a minute, but I had a chance to talk to Bonnie Crombie. She is the mayor of Mississauga, and of course, now that she has been reelected into heading into her third term, I think by the end of it, she will undoubtedly be the second longest serving mayor of Mississauga. So, and I talked to her about the way Mississauga has developed and changed even since she took over from Hazel, and clearly, housing is going to fall on the desks of the mayors and the municipal councils across this province. That's how they're going to have to manage all of this. And so I said, what kind of circumstance are you into when you look at having to implement a housing plan that we all call an affordable housing plan, by the way? It's not just more housing. How do we ensure that? Well, she got into, I thought, a very surgical, I'll call it, analysis of how the municipalities and the provinces, and to some degree the feds, are going to have to cooperate on this.
How do we work with the Ontario government, the federal government, and the development community to incentivize builders or developers to build more affordability into their new housing projects? And a lot of these financial incentives have to come from a different level of government, not at the expense of cities, because at the end of the day, we need to continue to invest in our cities to make them great. Our budgets don't allow for financial incentives.
So then, if I'm reading between the lines there, you're not really thrilled with the idea of foregoing the development fees for the developers in terms of how that would go into a lot of the infrastructure, all of the other amenities that would go around any area where you're building new and more affordable housing.
So that revenue that we would lose from DCs, it would be given as an incentive to developers, which, by the way, I don't think go towards reducing the costs. That just goes towards increasing their profitability. Frankly, that has to be made up somewhere. And I think the provincial and the federal government are well aware that that money has to come from somewhere. We would have to be compensated for any lost DCs. Now, I'd be willing to entertain reduced DCs or waiving of DCs in special circumstances, like building more housing affordability is one area, or certainly long-term care, seniors care. That tool is appropriate in some circumstances, but can't be widely used as a lever just to incentivize the building of market housing.
When the housing initiative was announced with great fanfare at Queen's Park, was there any consultation or conversation with you or the other mayors of the GTA? Because primarily that's where a lot of the heat is going to come around the housing. In as much as to say we're doing this, the developer charges and fees are on the table here, just so you know.
So certainly there has been wide-ranging discussions that the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing has come to our Ontario Big City Mayor caucuses regularly. I thank him for that. Premier has appeared once as well, but certainly there could have been more consultation. I know the task force that developed the housing blueprint for the province did not include any municipal leaders or any municipal planners. And I think that was a big oversight. I think that part of the equation was lacking when the blueprint was written.
No uncertain terms. The municipalities have been left out of this planning and the consultation. Period. It didn't just start this week with the committee hearings. So, when you're not including the big city mayors in these conversations, I don't care how strong a Mayor John Tory might be. I think this is going to be a dog's breakfast by the end of the whole thing. The ability to deliver 1.5 million homes in 10 years without municipalities on board, Keith, I think is going to be more than a challenge for this government. Now, 10 years out, that's a long view for a provincial government, but still, on the ground in the short term, I'm not sure you can get this thing rolling the way we need it to get any momentum behind it.
Well, one group they have been listening to is lobbyists. And we know that, developer lobbyists. And while the Greenbelt development on the Greenbelt is getting a lot of attention, the government has done other things as well, right? Including imposing new boundaries on the city of Hamilton, expanding them when the city didn't want to do that. And in Aurora, there was a development there that the city rejected. And the developer hired a lobbyist, Peter Van Loan, former member of Stephen Harper's government. And he went and met with the housing minister, Steve Clark. And lo and behold, part of this bill, that development in Aurora, a very specific development, will go ahead. And Minister Clark said, we were lobbying on this and we thought it was a good development and it was something the city staff had recommended. The council went against their own recommendations. So the province, after being lobbied by a conservative lobbyist, went, you know what, that development in Aurora is going ahead. Boom. End of thing for the city. So you can see why the cities weren't consulted. They weren't going to be listened to.
Yeah, John, I'm not sure how, even at that, though, we've almost created an environment where we know we need more housing. We need affordable housing. I mean, I'm not sure that just having more housing in the market solves the affordability problem immediately. There has to be some framework around that. But without the municipalities actually involved in this, sure, the province can do what the province wants to do, but it's not going to be at the pace that they have laid out and committed to.
Agreed. I also have raised some other questions, and that is, where are we going to get the labor to build all these homes? Mm-hmm. I mean, we just simply don't have the tradespeople today, nor is it on the books for recruitment of immigrants for tomorrow. And given a choice between building houses and having somebody in a long-term care home looking after you, you make the pick. Next is the time frame. As you and I know, houses don't increase in value ever, especially over time. I mean, nobody makes any money by just sitting on a house for 10 years. So the housing cost, the housing value today in a municipality is going to skyrocket over the next 10 years anyways because of the pressure and everything else being brought to bear. Thirdly, what does this do for young people or others who need housing now? Absolutely nothing. What it does is open the door so that 10 years from now, when they're in their 40s or 50s, they'll finally be able to not afford a home because they won't have enough down payment still because they're living on serf wages and trying to get by. I mean, the premise is remarkable, isn't it? I mean, it's like we've got to solve this problem of getting housing there, and it will be in the future, but we're going to make sure that everybody has access to it when in fact we know that's not going to be the case. So the last thing in all of this, though, is also the new mayor's powers. One can rightly say that there's lots of layers and layers of red tape in order to get where they are. I mean, it's abysmal to have the planning process in the city of Toronto, where I live, taking forever to try and get even minimal stuff done. But what the new mayor's powers have done, of course, is say that you can make decisions on housing in these particular jurisdictions with only a third of the support of council. I mean, Josh Matlow screaming and yelling in Toronto and a whole bunch of other people that this is an undemocratic circumstance. Well, it is. I mean, the reality is that the mayor of Toronto says, well, I'm only going to, I don't intend on using it. Well, it's on the books. It can be used. So when he's no longer in the chair next time and somebody else is, it's just kind of like, you know what? I got the power. I'm going to use it. There's a lot of complications with this stuff. There's a lot of money that's going to be made, but I come back to the main thing. I mean, my son moved from being a chef for 10 years because the business was, pretty tough, to being a carpenter. That was 4 years ago. And luckily, he's been employed full time during COVID because his company has all the Walmart renovation contracts. I mean, he's going to be in huge demand. If anybody's going to be able to afford a house, that guy's going to be, because of the amount of money he's going to be, holding out for to build a house anywhere. But what that means is those costs are going to be passed on. So what looks like what does it cost to actually build a house nowadays? I don't know, Dave. I mean, in my neighborhood, it's pretty big. But if it costs, if the market value for a house is in metropolitan Toronto, at least $1 million today, it's not going to be any lower 5 years from now, especially with the demands for more housing. I don't know how this solves anything, except there's going to be lots more houses, but it's going to be, as they say, within reach, but beyond belief.
You want undemocratic. I'll up you want undemocratic. They're going to appoint the regional chairs in Niagara, Peel, and York. So that's how they're going to help get past these municipalities. If I don't have a regional chair that's cooperating with me on these particular issues, I'm just going to get rid of it and I'll appoint another one. And, why would we stick with democracy there? And at the same time, they're really signaling that these two-tiered municipalities, they're going to have a close look at those, and we're going to go down to one tier, I would imagine. They're not saying that yet, but I suspect that's what's going to happen. So we're going to see the end of these two-tier municipalities, except where it works for them. And that's right now in Niagara, Peel, and York. That's where they want to get, as much housing crammed into those areas as they possibly can. And for some reason, they're going to appoint the chairs in those areas. Why? Instead of letting them, elect their own chair from their elected councillors. I don't understand, other than clearing the way for what their own agenda is all the way through. Same with these strong mayor powers. It all dovetails in, and it allows them to get ahead with their agenda quicker, but it certainly plows over a lot more than just the Greenbelt.
Well, when we look at that, though, and it was interesting to see how, yes, they're going to appoint the chairs in those regions. What they have done deftly is appointed the people who were in those chairs before the election. So they're able to say, well, there's continuity there, and we're just making sure that we have historic memory and muscle memory that we can continue on with. But to your point about eliminating those two-tier regions, let's face it, Patrick Brown and Bonnie Crombie are cheering the loudest for that to happen. Mississauga, Brampton want to be standalone. But then it becomes a question, what happens to a community like Caledon, which is so much smaller, and it relies on Brampton, Mississauga for things like policing, infrastructure, all of those bigger ticket items that they need to, have a safe and healthy community. They can't possibly afford to go it alone based on the history and the way things have developed. So, it's great to say, we'll pull it all apart and just kind of have the anti-amalgamation movement in Peel region. But boy, I would think people in Caledon, for example, John, might be a little concerned about what their future might be vis-a-vis the kind of town and community that they're going to be living in 5-6 years from now.
Yeah, and I know this kind of happens when what's happening here is it's winners and losers, right? And when you deal with that kind of mathematics, then you get local people who then decide, well, we're going to elect people who are on the opposite side of this, protecting us. Like and let's not forget that there's still issues. Like I just said, in the city of Toronto, you can make decisions with respect to legislation, but I mean, in a way, John Tory's a lame duck mayor, right? Like he's not coming back for another term, so he can use it as he wishes. But this does create the opportunity for others to rally around and try and provoke a showdown on some of these issues in different municipalities. So the political implications are not clear yet fully, but I would suspect that by the new year, you're going to get people on either side of the dividing line. and it's going to create some friction and some tension. I guess the real issue is, what's the bigger plan for the province? I don't mean to complicate this by spreading the net all the way over, but this is kind of pick and choose stuff, isn't it? Like, you get a car, you get a car, you get a car, you don't. It's like winning the lottery. So I get all of this stuff, but for the sake of picking winners and losers going forward, I don't know what the criteria is, other than, it's an opportunity to build houses. And if, you've got some mayors who might back you and a bunch of other, I don't know what the criteria has been, except just let's do these places.
I want to get to the education situation. Again, we're back into the looming possibility of a strike as we record this on Friday morning. And Sunday afternoon, 5 o'clock is sort of that arbitrary deadline in terms of whether or not they have to announce whether they're going on strike. I think, to be clear, Keith, just because it's that 5 o'clock deadline, it doesn't mean that one way or the other there will necessarily be a strike, or will there necessarily be a deal. They can talk their way through that deadline, just like in any other negotiation. And I think that's a healthy way to kind of let this thing play out.
They've said that, exactly. They've said, 5 p.m. Sunday is so that we can give parents a bit of a heads up with what they're dealing with Monday morning. But it doesn't mean they're going to stop talking. It doesn't mean the negotiations are over by any stretch. And as you say, often, this is what mediators in their art of mediating, imposing these kind of deadlines does somehow sharpen the minds and sharpen the pencils at the negotiating table sometimes. It seems to do the trick more times than not. But the big question now is, okay, if we're told Sunday night at 5, that, there's no deal and parents better prepare for no classes on Monday, or at least no in-person in-school classes, then what's the government's reaction going to be? I mean, Stephen Lecce, when the CUPE announced that, they were going to implement the 5-day strike notice, he didn't even wait for them to do it. When they told him, he just went out public and started crapping all over them without even waiting for them to explain why they were doing this. So they're going to do this same thing Sunday night? Are they going to pull out back to work legislation again without using the notwithstanding clause? Finding some other way around? Are we going to get to that debate about maybe making them essential workers? I don't know. But the government's going to have its plan ready now. So whatever's going to happen Sunday night at 5, the minute CUPE speaks, or perhaps even before CUPE speaks, the government will speak. It wants to run the narrative on this and making it all about, we've upped the offer, we've addressed the lowest paid workers, we're giving hundreds of millions, I think he said 360 million more, I forget how many, hundreds of millions more dollars on the table with this new offer, and CUPE's still not happy. Well, CUPE's saying, of course, it's not all about the money. Well, it never is. His negotiations are about all kinds of things. So both sides are still seemingly doing an awful lot through the media, without exact details, but there's certainly talking and batting each other back and forth through the media. So come Sunday night, I expect we'll see a little bit more of the same, and parents will be in a very frustrating position, but at least I guess Sunday at 5, they'll know that they have to line up that daycare or call their employer and say, I can't come in on Monday.
Well, John, if the province was looking at numbers that you've produced lately, they'd be in good shape if they decided that they were going to declare the education workers an essential service.
Well, I guess so, but the first thing I would do is advise them to have that back to work legislation ready to go. The public, this is now into an area where you can get at least 44 to 50% support in the province. We know that from the polling. And we also know, the three of us sitting here and many others, that this is the way in which unions negotiate, isn't it? Right to the very last minute. And it's kind of like, look what we pulled out of the hat. So it's not about money anymore. It's about something else. I think that we can have that debate about essential services. But right now, I'd basically say the ball is in the province's court. If they union box on Sunday night, it's basically, we'll make sure the House sits on Monday. You're back to work Tuesday or Wednesday, and there you go. That's done. So I think they've got the political ability and leeway to do it.
I think it's a bit of a clang in terms of messaging when we hear the education ministers start to talk about how important it is for us to make sure we're taking care of the well-being of our children in this province, and that the children are first, and that the children are the ones who have to be considered in any disruption that happens in education. Meanwhile, we have ICUs in kids' hospitals and pediatric wards that are overwhelmed. I mean, they're 125, 130% capacity in some cases. We've canceled surgeries at Sick Kids Hospital. And quite frankly, when you look at what goes on at Sick Kids Hospital or any of the children's hospitals, there isn't really any kind of elective surgeries going on there. These are surgeries that are necessary for the health and well-being of these kids. I saw a story last night where, a family in, I think it was in Halton, had the 2-year-old in the hospital, had to be moved to London to get the kind of care he needed. He's fine now, but this happened about a month ago. It's kind of come through the media. And the health minister finally popped out of her gopher hole this week and had the gall to say, oh, yeah, well, he got the care he needed in Ontario. Yeah, it was 180 kilometers or something away from where they were initially, and a lot of angst at their local hospital in terms of how they were going to treat him. They were considering actually moving him across the border to a hospital in Buffalo. So what happened to think of the children on the healthcare front, Keith? I mean, for God's sake, I don't know where she got this notion that she was going to be able to slide this by, but the health minister saying, no, we had a plan. We knew that this was coming, and we've talked to the hospitals. Everything is okay. Nothing to see here. Meanwhile, the hospitals are, their hair's on fire trying to deal with the pediatric situation.
Absolutely. And it's not just there. I mean, CHIO in Ottawa had to send a couple of kids to a hospital in Kingston. Same reason. They're way, way, way over capacity. Parents are waiting 24 hours with sick and throwing up children in emergency department waiting rooms. It's just stunning that she could, as you say, try and just slide this by. Oh, we had a plan. Is your plan to create a crisis? Are we back to that kind of thinking? Because, I mean, we know that they want to do more privatization of the healthcare system, and we're certainly at a crisis point with the children's hospitals this fall, winter season. I mean, it's frightening what could be. This is very, very early for the emergency departments to be overwhelmed and to have, as you say, I think the province's capacity for intensive care units for children is 110, and we've got 120 to 130 on any given day this week, intubated on ventilators in intensive care. And it's not COVID, it's the flu and the other respiratory. And they're pretending, the fall economic statement on Monday, which is also known as a mini budget, it's 6 months past the budget. Not one new dime to address this. Nothing really to address this other than stuff that was announced in the budget 6 months ago. Things have drastically changed in 6 months. And for her to have on that file just to come out and say, our plan, this was our plan, that's not much of a plan. And we did see someone FOI'd her talking points, her notes. And on her notes for public consumption, they had something about, there will be more privatization, or there will not be more privatization in the delivery of healthcare services in Ontario. The note was literally scratched out and replaced with their famous line, you will always use your OHIP card, not your credit card, when you get a health service. So they're definitely broaching this idea. They definitely want to bring in more private delivery, even private hospitals into Ontario. And yet they're saying everything's okay, this was part of our plan. It clearly looks like part of their plan was to create a crisis and then say the only way to solve that crisis is to bring in private delivery of healthcare. Right now, nurses, there's a huge nursing shortage. They're using agency nurses. They cost twice as much as a regular staff nurse. Well, what if we took off the 1% salary cap on nurses and gave them a little? They're paying twice as much for agency nurses. How is that fiscally even remotely responsible other than to line the pockets of these agencies? That's what's going to happen in all other areas of the healthcare sector as well, if their goal is clearly to bring in more private delivery and private systems in the healthcare. Why? I don't understand how this children's hospital, she says they had a plan. This clearly crept up on them in the last 6 months, and they announced nothing this week in their mini budget to say, this is a crisis, and here's what we're going to do to deal with it. They had nothing extra, and they point to, well, we upped, it's another $6 billion in healthcare spending this year that just in the budget. Well, that was 6 months ago. What's happening now?
The biggest problem that we have is the minister's inability to face the public and talk about and reassure people on these things. That's it. Mm-hmm. I mean, I don't know how she was chosen. Who knows the machinations of cabinet, but I think somebody might have said, look, he was standing out there for all those news conferences with Christine Elliott, and she got to know all kinds of things about the healthcare system, so we'll put her in. I mean, she's got the personality of a jail guard, not of somebody with a bedside manner that needs to be. No, I'm being politically critical here because I think they made an error. I think
Sure, entirely.
if you look back to all of the other healthcare ministers, whether it's George Smitherman or Dennis Timbrell, going as far back as that, or a whole bunch of others, they've been tried to get out in front of these things to assure people that we're looking after you. We do have a plan. We are taking this serious. We empathize with you. And some of them have taken a lot of heat. Others have managed to skate through it. But the reality is they've tried to appear to be in control of a system that is absolutely vital to people. There is none of that. None. Zero here. The minister came out and made a statement the other day, and I'm sure it was like as rare as hen's teeth down there. It's unfortunate for a government who faces a crisis in healthcare, which they are, which has been, also a product of what has come before, and now is kind of left just to hang out there for parents and everybody else to deal with. And there's nobody from the government who's basically saying, look, I got your back. I'm trying to do what I can. And even honestly saying, look, we're having to broach issues of private involvement in the healthcare system. It has worked in other places because we can't afford to do it all, especially when we've got a growing and aging population ahead of us. We're going to have to get through this. For a health minister to say that this early in the mandate is not a bad thing. You can actually get consultation going and a bunch of other things, but no. This is a minister who I think doesn't like to meet with people and has been completely off the radar. I'm sorry it's happened, because I know friends and others who are now feeling that the government has abandoned them, when in fact we were so used to Dr. Tam and everybody else, with the premier and the health minister and whoever else was there, being in our living rooms almost every day for almost 2 years, and it's kind of like now vanished, vaporized. So I think it's a bad mark on this government. I don't know how they change it, because you would have to say, I've lost faith in my healthcare minister in order to change somebody out of that role. On the other hand, I don't know how she's going to do if she's pushed out reluctantly to talk with people. But for God's sake, it's healthcare, and it's in crisis. And we need to have people out there assuring us that things are actually moving along and that things are going to be better, or we're going to get through this in a different way. And she's just not the one to be doing that. She's a political loser right now.
Well, I think you framed it well maybe a couple of weeks back when you just said this is ultimately a withdrawal of service. That's what this is. We have healthcare service withdrawn from us. Before we close, I just want to point out something we talked about on Now and Next earlier in the week with Erin and Becky Coles. That's our daily show that we do. And we highlighted the report that came from the Daily Bread Food Bank this week. They do an annual report called Who's Hungry? They determined in that report that in the calendar year of 2022, Toronto food banks will have more than 2 million visits. More than 2 million visits to food banks. More than 180,000 visits a month. Prior to the pandemic, it was 60,000. And we thought the food banks were, really stretched. 18% of food bank users in this city, in Toronto alone, 18% spend 100% of their income on a monthly basis on housing and utilities. They have nothing left for anything else. The fastest growing demographic, to your point, John, around healthcare is the 55 plus group that needs to be relying on food banks. So this is a crisis, again, that we want to stick our head in the sand about. We put a call into the Minister for Children and Community Services. Happens to be Marilee Fullerton, who did so well with the long-term care portfolio. We just, listen, the report's out there. We would invite you to come onto the podcast and talk about what are the next steps. How is the government going to deal with this? Thank you for your inquiry, your request. The minister's not available to do any kind of interviews or recordings. Stop, full stop. When? When the fuck are you people going to stand up for the people who need you more than anything? Whether it's the kids in the kids' hospitals, whether it's the elders in the seniors' homes and the long-term care, whether it is the folks who are living in legislated poverty in this province. When are you going to do something about it? John, there's no courage. There's no leadership at so many levels here, but we are going to release the green belt so the developers can do well. Sorry to end on a rant, but it's just, come on.
No, but I think, I think if you were to poll those people who are likely conservative voters, you would have a list of topics that are very different than other people. And so if you're a government, maybe you're going to cater in that direction. The bottom line in all of this, however, is that governments have to function over the longer term. And if you are going to antagonize or ignore certain groups, then it's going to spark a coalition of interests, which in fact are going to end up on your doorstep at some point. I don't think people got into politics not to be heard. And I think that, if you're in the center and you're telling everybody not to talk about it, it's going to come back on you. I think, Dave, we're reaching, a crisis situation in lack of communication more than anything else. And I think the government needs to change where it's coming from on a lot of these files.
Well, we're going to, just by the way, if you want to hear the whole interview with Bonnie Crombie, we have a show called Now and Next Extra. So you can listen to that. It's going to be featured on the weekend. And that you can find at nowandnext.supercast.com. Sorry, Keith, you want to?
Oh, no, I was just going to say,
remark?
I think if anything, with Minister Fullerton and Minister Jones, the health minister and the children's minister, it shows they're following orders. They're not standing up because they're being told to sit down. They're not advocating because they're being told to sit down and stop. Same with we rarely see the premier. When we do, we often won't take questions. This is a deliberate communication strategy. I know John called it a crisis in communications. From our point of view, we view it that way. I don't know that they see it that way. I think they see it works for them this way. I don't understand why. It seems, as you say, we've been abandoned as healthcare patients and the children, but communications-wise, this is a deliberate plan.
Well, the good news is Santa Claus comes to town this weekend. So let's leave it on that note. If you're heading out to the parades in and around the GTA, get out there and enjoy the weather in this part of the world. Anyway, it's going to be pretty decent. If you're otherwise affected by the storms, stay safe. And we'll be back in your inbox next week, Friday, with On the Ledge. I'm Dave Trafford with John Wright and Keith Leslie. It's your Ontario Politics Podcast.
This is SSN.
Story Studio Network.